They say love is blind. But what happens when blindness itself becomes the lie? When the very foundation of your marriage, your sacrifice, your entire existence for 3 years was built on deception. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 72 years old. Today, I'm going to tell you about the most devastating betrayal of my life. A betrayal that didn't just break my heart. It shattered everything I thought I knew about trust, love, and the man I called my husband. Before we begin, if you enjoy these real-life stories of betrayal, redemption, and shocking truths, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories need to be heard, and your support helps me share them with the world. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Are you listening while cooking dinner in Texas, commuting to work in London, relaxing at home in Mumbai? Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. I love hearing from you all. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 3 years ago, I was a different woman. Not just younger, but hopeful. Desperate, yes, but still holding on to that fragile thread of hope that somehow everything would work out. My father, Richard, was dying. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe less. The treatments were experimental, expensive, and not covered by insurance. We're talking about $300,000. Money I didn't have. Money nobody in our family had. I had worked as a librarian my whole life. A good, honest job, but not one that left you with savings like that. My father had been a carpenter, a man who built beautiful things with his hands, but never quite built a financial cushion for emergencies. And this wasn't just an emergency. This was a countdown clock, ticking away the last precious moments I had with the man who raised me, who taught me to read, who walked me down the aisle when I married my first husband, God rest his soul. My first husband, James, had passed away 15 years earlier. Heart attack. Sudden. One moment, he was laughing at something on television. The next, he was gone. We never had children. It was just one of those things that never happened for us. And by the time we thought about other options, we were content with our life together. Just the two of us. When he died, I thought that was it for me. I was 57, alone, and convinced I'd spend the rest of my days in solitude. And I was fine with that. I had my books, my father, my small circle of friends. It was enough. But then cancer came knocking, and suddenly nothing was enough. I needed money, and I needed it fast. I took out loans. I started a fundraising campaign online that barely made a dent. I sold everything of value I owned. James's watch collection, my mother's jewelry, even our wedding china. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. I watched the numbers in my bank account dwindle, while the treatment costs kept climbing, and my father kept deteriorating. His skin turned yellow. His eyes grew distant. Time was running out, and I was helpless. That's when I met Marcus Wellington through an agency. Not a dating agency, a practical arrangement agency. I know how that sounds, but hear me out. There are wealthy people in this world with needs that money alone cannot fulfill. They need companionship, care, human connection. And there are people like me, desperate enough to provide those things in exchange for financial security. The agency was discreet, professional, and surprisingly compassionate about matching people's needs. Marcus was 68 years old, a retired investment banker, and completely blind, or so I was told. He had lost his vision in a car accident 5 years prior, the same accident that had killed his wife of 40 years. He lived alone in a massive estate on the outskirts of town, cared for by a rotating staff of nurses and assistants who he apparently couldn't stand. He was difficult, demanding, and went through caregivers like tissues. But he was also incredibly wealthy, and he was looking for something more permanent. Not just a caregiver, but a companion, a wife. The arrangement was straightforward. Marriage in name and legal commitment. I would live with him, care for him, be his eyes in a world he could no longer see. In exchange, he would cover all my father's medical expenses immediately and provide me with a generous monthly allowance. When I asked why marriage and not just employment, his representative explained that Marcus had been burned by too many people who saw him as a paycheck. He wanted commitment. He wanted someone who couldn't just walk away when things got difficult. Marriage provided that legal and emotional bond. I know what you're thinking. How could I agree to something like that? Wasn't it just selling myself? And you're right to think that. I wrestled with it for days. I prayed about it. I cried about it. But then I sat in that hospital room, watching my father struggle to breathe, watching him try to smile for me, even though I knew he was in agony. And I made my choice. Right or wrong, I made my choice. The wedding was small, clinical almost. Just me, Marcus, the officiant, and a witness from the agency. Marcus wore dark sunglasses that covered his eyes completely. He held a white cane. When we exchanged vows, his voice was deep, measured, emotionless. I slipped a ring onto his finger, and he did the same for me, his movements careful and deliberate, his hands finding mine through touch alone. Or so it seemed. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, there was no kiss, no celebration, just a handshake, some signed paperwork, and a wire transfer that hit my account within the hour. $300,000. My father's life, bought and paid for with my freedom. I moved into Marcus's estate that same day. The house was enormous. 8 bedrooms, a library that made my heart sing, gardens that stretched for acres. It was beautiful and cold and lonely. Marcus showed me to my room, separate from his, and explained his routine. He woke at 6. He liked his breakfast at 7:30. 2 eggs scrambled, wheat toast, black coffee. He spent mornings in his study, listening to audiobooks or having documents read to him by text-to-speech software for the investments he still managed. Lunch at noon. Afternoons in the garden, if weather permitted, or in the music room where he played piano beautifully. Dinner at 6. Evening in the sitting room. Bed by 10. My job was simple. Be present, be attentive, be his connection to the visual world he'd lost. Describe the sunset. Read him the newspaper. Help him dress when he requested it. Navigate him through spaces when his staff wasn't available. Feed him when his hands shook too much to manage utensils, which happened more often than I expected for a man his age. I was his wife in every practical sense except one. We maintained separate bedrooms, separate lives, connected only by this transactional arrangement. The first few weeks were awkward. We barely spoke beyond necessity. But slowly, something shifted. I started reading to him every evening. Not just news, but novels, poetry, essays. He had incredible taste in literature. We'd discuss what I read, debate interpretations, laugh at particularly absurd passages. He told me stories about his late wife, about his career, about traveling the world when he could still see it. I told him about James, about my father's treatments which were showing promising results, about my love for old libraries. We became friends, real friends. And that surprised me more than anything. I had entered this arrangement expecting coldness, transaction, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, I found companionship with a man who was sharp, witty, and surprisingly kind. Marcus had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard. He'd make observations about people, based solely on their voices, their footsteps, the way they breathed, and he was almost always right about their character. It was uncanny. He never touched me inappropriately, never made demands beyond our agreement. He respected my space, my grief over my father's condition, my need for privacy. In return, I gave him my full attention during our time together. I described everything in vivid detail, the way morning light filtered through the curtains, how the roses in the garden were blooming pink and red, the expression on the mailman's face when he delivered packages. Marcus would listen intently, sometimes closing his eyes behind those ever-present dark glasses, a small smile playing on his lips. My father's health improved. The treatments were working. Slowly, painfully, but working. He gained weight. His color returned. The doctor started using words like remission and optimistic. Every time I visited him at the treatment center, he'd ask about Marcus, about my new life. I'd smile and tell him everything was fine. Better than fine. And in many ways, it was true. I had saved my father's life. That's what mattered. But there were moments, small moments, that nagged at me. Nothing I could put my finger on exactly. Just inconsistencies. Like the time I came into the study and found Marcus standing by the window, perfectly still, facing the garden. When I asked what he was doing, he startled slightly and said he enjoyed feeling the sun on his face, that he could sense where the window was by the warmth. Reasonable explanation. Except something about his posture, the way he'd been standing, seemed too focused, too directed at something specific outside. Or the time I rearranged some furniture in the sitting room, just moved a side table a few feet to make space for a new lamp I'd purchased. Marcus navigated around it perfectly that evening, without his cane, without fumbling, without even a pause. When I mentioned it seemed like he'd known the table had been moved, he laughed it off, said he'd heard me moving it earlier and made a mental adjustment. Again, reasonable. Blind people develop extraordinary spatial awareness. I'd read about it. It made sense. There was the incident with the photograph. I'd placed a new picture frame on the mantel, a photo of my father and me from my childhood. I hadn't mentioned it to Marcus, but a few days later, he asked me about the photograph on the mantel. Is that you as a child? I was puzzled. How did he know there was a photograph there? He said he'd felt the frame while running his hands along the mantel, felt the glass, asked the housekeeper about it. Logical. Except I'd never seen him explore the mantel that way, and the housekeeper was off that week. But I pushed the thought away. I was being paranoid, seeing conspiracy where there was only coincidence. The truth is, I didn't want to see what was right in front of me. I had built a life in that house. Not the life I'd imagined for myself, but a life nonetheless. My father was getting better. I had financial security. I had friendship with Marcus. Real intellectual connection. I had purpose. Why would I want to jeopardize that with suspicions and doubts? So I ignored the little voice in my head. I told myself I was imagining things. I focused on my duties, my routines, my carefully constructed new normal. I started keeping a diary. I hadn't kept one since I was a young woman. But something about the strangeness of my situation, the complexity of my feelings, demanded documentation. I needed somewhere to process everything. The diary became my confidant, my therapist, my safe space to explore thoughts I couldn't voice aloud. I wrote about my guilt over essentially selling myself into marriage. I wrote about my growing affection for Marcus, how confusing it was to care for someone I'd married for money. I wrote about my fears that my father's cancer would return. I wrote about my loneliness, despite being surrounded by staff and married to a man I spent every day with. And I wrote about my doubts, the small inconsistencies I'd noticed, The way Marcus sometimes seemed to react to visual cues. The time he commented on my new dress being a lovely color before I'd told him what color it was, he'd apologized immediately, said he'd meant to ask what color it was, that he'd misspoken. But had he? I documented everything in that diary, not because I genuinely believed Marcus was deceiving me, but because writing it down helped me dismiss it. Seeing my suspicions on paper made them seem silly, paranoid, ungrateful. I kept the diary in my bedroom, in the drawer of my nightstand, my private space that Marcus never entered. We had an understanding about boundaries. His bedroom was his domain, mine was mine, and the rest of the house was shared space. In over 2 years of marriage, he had never once come into my room uninvited. Why would he? He couldn't see anyway. There was nothing in there for him. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. My father went into full remission. The doctors were calling it a miracle. I was calling it the best $300,000 ever spent, even if I had sold my soul for it. But had I really? Marcus wasn't cruel. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't even unpleasant. He was just a man who needed help, and I was the woman helping him. We'd both gotten what we needed from this arrangement. Where was the harm? By the 3rd year, something unexpected happened. I realized I'd fallen in love with him. Not passionate, sweep you off your feet love, but deep, abiding affection. The kind of love that grows from shared quiet mornings, inside jokes, comfortable silences, intellectual debates over dinner. I looked forward to our evenings together. I missed him on the rare occasions I traveled to visit my father. I found myself wanting to reach out and touch his hand, to close the physical distance that our arrangement had mandated. But I never did, because that wasn't our agreement. We were companions, not lovers. He'd made that clear from the beginning. This was business, wrapped in legal marriage, softened by friendship, but business nonetheless. He loved his first wife deeply. I could hear it in his voice when he spoke of her. I was just the woman who'd agreed to be his eyes for money, nothing more. Still, I wondered sometimes if he felt it too. The shift between us. The way our conversations had deepened. The way he'd laugh at my jokes, really laugh, with genuine delight. The way he'd ask my opinion on important matters, financial decisions, even personal choices. He valued my input. He respected my intelligence. He seemed to care. But was that love? Or was I projecting my own feelings onto a man who was simply grateful for competent, pleasant company? Post P. I never wrote about loving him in my diary. That felt too vulnerable, too real. I wrote around it, about appreciation and respect and affection. But never that 4-letter word. As if not writing it would keep it from being true. As if I could protect myself from the pain of loving someone who would never love me back by simply not acknowledging it on paper. Yesterday started like any other day. I woke at 5:30, before Marcus, as I always did. I made coffee, watched the sunrise from the kitchen window, prepared for another day of routine. Marcus came down at 6 precisely, dressed in his usual dark slacks and button-down shirt. I'd offered many times to help him dress, but he preferred to do it himself, said it made him feel independent. I understood that. We all need to feel capable of something. Breakfast was quiet. He seemed distracted, distant even. When I asked if something was wrong, he smiled that thin smile of his and said he was fine, just thinking about some investments. He asked me to read him the financial section of the newspaper, which I did. He listened, nodded, made notes on his Braille note-taker. Everything seemed normal. Utterly, completely normal. After breakfast, He said he was going to spend the morning in his study and didn't need my assistance. That was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes he liked to work alone, listening to his audiobooks or dictating emails to his voice-controlled computer. I took the opportunity to run errands, grocery shopping, picking up his prescriptions from the pharmacy, stopping by the bookstore to find a new novel we could read together in the evenings. I returned home around 2 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. The housekeeper had the day off, and the gardener worked outside, so he wouldn't have heard anything from within the house. I carried the groceries to the kitchen, put everything away, and decided to go upstairs to change out of my shopping clothes into something more comfortable before I checked on Marcus. That's when I realized I'd forgotten my phone in my bedroom that morning. I headed upstairs, walked down the long hallway toward my room, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet runner. I wasn't trying to be quiet. I wasn't sneaking. I was just walking normally, as I did every day, in a house where sound tended to get absorbed by expensive rugs and thick walls. My bedroom door was ajar. Just slightly. I always closed it completely when I left. Always. It was a habit, a small piece of privacy in a house where I was constantly on call. My hand froze on the doorknob. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't have told you why. Some instinct, some primal warning system that something was wrong. I pushed the door open slowly, carefully, and there he was, Marcus, sitting on my bed, in my private space, in the room he had never entered in 3 years. That alone would have been shocking enough. But what he was doing, what I saw, it shattered my entire world in the span of a single heartbeat. He was reading my diary, not listening to it, not having it read to him, reading it. His dark glasses were off, set on the nightstand beside him. His eyes, those eyes that were supposed to be blind, sightless, useless, were moving across the pages, left to right, top to bottom, reading, actually reading. His expression was focused, intent, absorbed in my private words. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, something, because his head snapped up, and for the first time in 3 years, my husband looked directly at me. Not in the general direction of my voice, not toward where he'd last heard me move, but directly, precisely, unmistakably at me. His eyes met mine. Clear, hazel eyes that could see perfectly well. We stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I was hallucinating, that there had to be some explanation. But there was no explanation, not one that made sense, not one that didn't mean what I knew it meant. He didn't look away, didn't pretend, didn't scramble to put his glasses back on, or fumble with the diary, or make any of the movements a blind man would make upon being caught somewhere he shouldn't be. He just looked at me with those seeing eyes and said, in that calm, measured voice I'd come to know so well, "I'm not blind, Eleanor. I never was. I watched everything." The diary slipped from his hands onto the bed. I watched it fall as if in slow motion. That leather-bound book that contained 3 years of my most private thoughts. 3 years of doubts and fears and confessions. 3 years of my soul laid bare. And he'd read it. All of it, with eyes that could see perfectly well. What? It was all I could manage. One word. A question that encompassed everything and nothing. Marcus stood up slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal. "Please let me explain." "Explain." My voice came out strangled, foreign. "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for 3 years? That everything was a lie?" "Not everything." He took a step toward me, I took a step back, my back hitting the door frame. My feelings weren't a lie. Our friendship wasn't a lie. You can see, I was stating the obvious, but I needed to say it out loud, needed to make it real. You've always been able to see. The accident. There was an accident. My wife did die, but I wasn't injured. I could have been, should have been, by all accounts. I was driving. It was my fault. She died because of me, and I walked away without a scratch. His voice cracked slightly. Do you have any idea what that kind of guilt does to a person? So you decided to pretend to be blind. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh, but nothing about this was funny. That was your solution, to fake a disability? It wasn't planned. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd never seen him make before, because blind people don't typically use visual-oriented gestures. Everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. After Margaret died, I couldn't function. I couldn't face the world. People looked at me and saw a killer. I saw it in their eyes, the questions they were too polite to ask. Why did I survive? Why was I unscathed when she was gone? So you hid behind blindness. I retreated behind it. He was choosing his words carefully now. At first, I just stopped going out, stopped seeing people. But when I did have to interact with the world, I'd wear dark glasses, carry a cane. People stopped looking at me with judgment and started looking at me with pity. It was better, easier, and then it just continued. It became my reality. If I was blind, I was a victim too. Not just the man who killed his wife through careless driving. I shook my head, trying to clear it, trying to understand. And me? What was I? Part of your elaborate performance? No. He said it firmly, definitively. You were real, the realest thing in my life in 5 years. I put out that listing with the agency because I was lonely, yes, but also because I'd trapped myself in this lie and couldn't find a way out. I thought if I married someone who needed the arrangement as much as I did, someone who had their own reasons for accepting the situation, it would be, I don't know, sustainable, a life I could live. While lying to me every single day. The anger was starting to break through the shock now. Hot, burning rage that made my hands shake. While watching me dress you, feed you, describe a world you could see perfectly well. Was it funny? Did you laugh at me when I wasn't looking? Oh wait, you were always looking, weren't you? I never laughed at you. Never. He looked genuinely distressed now, which only made me angrier, because how dare he feel bad when he was the architect of this entire deception? Eleanor, I came to care for you deeply. These 3 years were a lie. I was shouting now, something I rarely did. Every moment, every conversation, My voice broke. I trusted you. I let myself care about you. I couldn't finish that sentence. Couldn't admit out loud what I'd written in that diary he'd violated. I know. His voice was soft. I read it. I know how you feel about me. The humiliation of that crashed over me like a wave. He'd read my most private thoughts. He knew I loved him. He'd known I was falling for him, and he'd let it happen. Let me make a fool of myself. Let me pour my heart onto pages that he would read with his perfectly functional eyes. Get out. My voice was cold now, controlled. The anger had crystallized into something hard and sharp. Get out of my room. Out of my space. The one place that was supposed to be mine. Eleanor, please. Get out. I screamed it this time, and he flinched. Good. I wanted him to flinch. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the pain that was tearing through me. He moved past me, careful not to touch me, and walked into the hallway. I slammed the door behind him, locked it, and slid down to the floor, my back against the wood. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours, time lost meaning. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of the last 3 years through this new, horrifying lens. Every time I'd described something to him that he could see perfectly well. Every time I'd helped him navigate a room he knew better than I did. Every time I'd cut his food or buttoned his shirt or read to him from books he could have read himself. He'd watched me do all of it, watched me with those lying eyes. And the worst part, the part that made me want to be sick, was that he'd watched me fall in love with him. He'd seen it happening in real time. The way I'd look at him when I thought he couldn't see. The way I'd smile when he said something kind. The small gestures of affection I'd allowed myself because I thought they were invisible to him. He'd seen all of it. And he'd said nothing. I pulled myself up from the floor and grabbed the diary from my bed where he'd left it. I flipped through the pages, wondering what exactly he'd read. Everything, probably. Years of my private thoughts, my struggles, my gradual transformation from bitter resentment about our arrangement to something like contentment, to something like love. It was all there. Documented proof of my foolishness. Period. There was a soft knock on my door. Eleanor. His voice was muffled through the wood. We need to talk about this. Period. We need to talk? I yanked the door open, fury giving me courage. Fury. We need to talk? You've had 3 years to talk, Marcus. 3 years to tell me the truth. 3 years of opportunities to be honest with me. And you chose lies. Every single day, you chose lies. I was afraid. He looked small suddenly, despite being taller than me. I was afraid you'd leave. Afraid I'd lose the only good thing in my life since Margaret died. So instead, you built that good thing on deception. I was crying now, angry tears that I wiped away furiously. Did you ever think about how I'd feel when I found out? And I would have found out eventually, Marcus. You couldn't keep this up forever. Period. I know. He looked down at his hands. I've been trying to find a way to tell you. That's why I was reading your diary. I know that's not an excuse. It was a terrible invasion of your privacy. But I needed to know how you really felt. Whether there was any chance you might understand. Understand? The word came out as a laugh, bitter and harsh. Understand that you manipulated me? Used my desperate situation to trap me in a marriage based on lies? That you watched me, day after day, playing a role, performing blindness while I exhausted myself, trying to be everything you needed. It wasn't all performance. His voice was pleading now. My grief was real. My loneliness was real. My feelings for you were real. But you weren't real. That was the heart of it. The core truth that made everything else impossible. The man I fell in love with doesn't exist. He was a character you created. An elaborate fiction. I don't even know who you are. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm a coward. That's who I am. A coward who lost his wife and couldn't face the world without a shield. A coward who met an incredible woman and couldn't risk losing her by being honest. A coward who watched you sacrifice yourself for your father and never told you that I would have helped you anyway. Without the marriage, without the arrangement, just because you deserved help. I stared at him. What? I would have paid for your father's treatment regardless. He met my eyes, and I had to resist the urge to look away from that direct gaze I'd never truly experienced before. After I met you that first time, heard your story, saw your desperation and your love for your father, I would have helped. But you'd already agreed to the arrangement, and I was selfish enough to let it stand because I wanted you here. I wanted someone who saw me as worthy of care, even if it was only because of a contract. The floor seemed to tilt under my feet. You're saying I didn't need to marry you at all? You needed the money. I had the money. The marriage was just my insurance policy. My way of keeping you bound to me. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Turns out it didn't work anyway. You're going to leave now. I know you are. He was right. I was going to leave. I had to leave. But his words had opened up a new chasm of pain. I'd sold myself for nothing. The sacrifice hadn't even been necessary. If I'd just asked for help, if I'd found a different wealthy patron, if I'd pushed harder with the fundraising, there might have been another way. A way that didn't cost me 3 years of my life and my ability to trust. My father, I said slowly, is in remission. The treatments worked. That's the only good thing that came from this nightmare. The only thing that makes any of it worthwhile. Eleanor, I'm leaving. I cut him off. I'll contact a lawyer about the divorce. Given the circumstances, given that our entire marriage was based on fraud, I doubt it will be complicated. The money, he started. Keep it. I don't want anything from you. That wasn't entirely true. I'd need something to start over, to find a new place to live. But I couldn't think about practicalities right now. I could only think about getting out of this house, away from this man, away from the rubble of the life I'd built on lies. Where will you go? That's not your concern anymore. I moved past him, heading for my closet to start packing. You gave up the right to concern yourself with my life when you decided to base our entire relationship on deception. He stood in my doorway, watching me pull a suitcase from the closet. Always watching. That's what he'd said, wasn't it? I watched everything. Every moment I thought was private. Every gesture I believed was unseen. Every vulnerable moment when I'd let my guard down because I thought I was invisible to those blind eyes. For what it's worth, he said, quietly, I do love you. I know you don't believe me. I know you can't believe me. But it's true. The only true thing about me for the past 3 years has been my love for you. I stopped packing and turned to face him. How am I supposed to believe anything you say? You've proven that you're an exceptional liar, that you can maintain a charade for years without breaking character. So why would I trust this? Why would I trust that this isn't just another manipulation? He had no answer for that. Because there was no answer. Trust, once shattered, can't be simply glued back together with declarations of love. It has to be rebuilt, piece by piece, with time and honesty and consistent action. And we didn't have time. I'd already lost 3 years to his lies. I wasn't going to lose any more. I packed in silence while he watched from the doorway. When my suitcase was full, I zipped it closed and turned to face him one last time. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Marcus. I hope you find a way to forgive yourself for your wife's death. I hope you find the courage to face the world as yourself, without hiding behind lies. But I won't be here to see it. I walked past him, down the stairs, through the house that had been my home for 3 years. The beautiful, cold, lonely house, where I'd been both wife and caregiver to a man who was neither blind nor honest. At the front door, I paused, but I didn't look back. Looking back would only make leaving harder, and leaving was the only option left. My car was in the driveway where I'd left it hours earlier, back when I was still a woman who trusted her husband, who believed in the life she'd built. That woman was gone now. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat. As I pulled away from the estate, I caught a glimpse of Marcus in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway, watching me leave with those eyes that had seen everything all along. I pressed harder on the accelerator, putting distance between us, between me and the greatest deception of my life. They say love is blind, but sometimes blindness itself is the cruelest deception of all. My name is Eleanor. I'm 72 years old, and today I learned that the man I loved never existed. But I'm still here. I survived losing my first husband. I survived almost losing my father. And I'll survive this too. Because survival is what I do. It's who I am. And no lie, no matter how elaborate, can take that away from me.